In an urban neighborhood where injustice was a constant murmur between the walls of buildings, where the voices of past generations still seemed to vibrate in the streets, the sun was slowly setting. The golden light cast long, uncertain shadows on the sidewalks, where pedestrians rushed in an incessant flow, all the while dodging the invisible cracks in the system that kept them away from the privileges of the most powerful. The buildings, old and worn, stood like silent witnesses to the struggle of the most vulnerable, the concrete and brick imprisoning dreams and hopes crushed under the weight of centuries of injustice. Maya, a black woman in her 40s, stood alone on the corner of a crowded avenue. His measured steps resonated on the cold pavement, like an echo of his journey, a path made of sacrifices, doubts and daily struggles. The city, which she knew in every corner, had shaped her, had forged her in the fire of its difficulties. However, today, an unusual serenity inhabited his eyes. He was calm, but there was also a fire in his eyes, a fierce determination, born from years of overcoming obstacles invisible to those who did not understand. She had learned to be strong, to never let herself be destabilized by the brutality of prejudice. Maya was an FBI analyst, a position she earned after years of sacrifice. A journey strewn with pitfalls, sleepless nights spent deciphering files, proving one's worth at each stage, at each ordeal. She knew that every progress she made was a victory not only for her, but for all black women who, like her, had to fight against stereotypes and society's limited expectations. Every document she signed was an act of resistance. Each report she sent was a cry of recognition in a world where the color of her skin often seemed to be a barrier to her skills. That evening, she had decided to take some time for herself, to settle a personal matter in the neighborhood where she grew up. A vibrant neighborhood, but often overlooked by those who did not understand its nuances, struggles and dreams. Maya was never completely comfortable here, but this neighborhood also had another side to her. That of her childhood, of her mother who had raised her with strength, of her childhood friends who had grown up with her and who, like her, carried within them invisible scars of social injustice. Today, she was returning to this world that she had left for another, more distant, but not without pain. The city, beautiful but cruel, was never foreign to him. As she crossed the street, her thoughts mingled with the familiar sounds of traffic. The purring of a car engine, the distant cries of children playing in an alley, the indistinct conversations of passers-by. Then suddenly, a distinctive sound of tires squealing on asphalt. A patrol vehicle suddenly pulled up beside her, its engine roaring like a silent threat. A shiver ran through her body, but she didn't stop. She had seen this kind of scene too many times to let fear overcome her. She knew what these meetings entailed. The officer who emerged was a man in his 30s, his uniform impeccable, but his cold, arrogant eyes betrayed an attitude she knew well. He was the type of policeman who thought he was above everything. He thought the street belonged to him, that he could humiliate whoever he wanted without consequences. He stood in front of Maya, his hands on his hips, a smirk playing on his lips. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said in a voice that suggested a superiority that he didn't even hide. "Don't you have anything better to do than hang around these neighborhoods at this hour?" Maya stopped, a slight grimace on her lips. She wasn't surprised. She had experienced this attitude too often to be destabilized by it. The suspicious looks, the baseless questions, the demeaning remarks, the silent humiliation, all this was part of everyday life. She had endured it for years, knew how to do it, how to survive it, but each time it was a little more painful.
A little more frustrating.
But she never, ever wavered. She straightened up, her gaze hardening for a moment. "I go where I want, and I have business to attend to, sir," she replied calmly, her tone firm, although the echo of disapproval was perceptible. "And if you have a question, I suggest you ask." The agent studied her for a moment. Then, as if she were just an insignificant detail in his day, he leaned down to inspect her from top to bottom. He raised his eyebrows, amused, as if her mere presence was enough to put him above her. It was obvious that he saw her as just another black woman in the neighborhood, a figure he could humiliate without consequence. "I don't mind you hanging around here, but you're going to have to show me your papers, ma'am," he said, holding out his hand. "You know it's late, And I need to make sure you're not doing anything suspicious. Maya took a deep breath, aware of the humiliation he sought to inflict. But she wasn't like the others. She had overcome too many ordeals, too many struggles to allow herself to be taken down by such an insignificant man in the shadow of his uniform. With calm determination, she reached out, pulled out her FBI badge, and brandished it in front of him. This little piece of plastic, simple and official, was much more than that. It was proof of her journey, a silent response to all those who had judged her too often. In her hands, she felt the power of hard work, of recognition as a professional, of a black woman who had forged a path where many thought she could never go. It was also a guarantee of legitimacy, a protection against those who sought to demean it. "I'm an FBI agent," she said authoritatively, without a tremor.
You don't ask me for my papers like that.
"Will that be enough to satisfy you, or do I need to show you my credentials too?" Police Officer Monroe, seeing the badge, burst out laughing, a disdainful, almost stifled laugh, as if he had just discovered a prank that amused him. He looked Maya up and down, his gaze insistent and condescending, as if the simple fact that she was there, in front of him, in possession of this card that he considered a joke, was proof of the incongruity of the situation. He looked at her with obvious contempt, certain that his authority would be unquestioned, especially when faced with a black woman in a neighborhood where, in his eyes, she had no business being. "You," he said, holding back laughter, his tone sharp as a razor. "Iphibi. You must be a model for a TV show. That badge has no power here. I suggest you go home before you waste my time." The words echoed in the hot air of the street, but Maya didn't flinch. Inside her, a dull anger began to rise, pulsing with force. There was always that moment, a split second, when indignation became a beast ready to roar. But Maya had learned to silence this beast, to tame it before it took control. She knew that responding to violence with violence would only fuel the spiral of injustice she had experienced her entire life. However, the policeman's gaze, filled with certainty and condescension, touched the fine line between self-control and the imminent explosion of accumulated frustration. "I'll call my superior," she said calmly, her tone measured but firm. "But I advise you to prepare yourself for accountability." The policeman shrugged his shoulders disdainfully, believing himself already victorious in a situation that he perceived as a simple routine arrest. He thought that, in front of him, a black woman in all simplicity, he could dictate the rules. Maya took a few steps away to call her superior, her phone vibrating against her palm. She knew that, in these moments, the importance of not losing your calm was crucial. She did not call a colleague on her team directly. No, she knew that a higher hierarchy was needed here, a lieutenant in charge of the district, an authority who could actually influence the course of things more effectively than an internal complaint that would be buried in bureaucracy. "I am Officer Maya Warren, and I have been unjustifiably arrested by an officer in your department. I am asking you to intervene immediately." She waited a few seconds, the sounds of the street and the commotion around her becoming a vague background noise. The situation seemed suspended in time, and Officer Monroe stood there, motionless, as if anchored in his arrogance, staring stubbornly at his phone. He seemed indifferent to the situation, thinking that no matter what was happening, there was no reason to worry about the legality of his actions. The lieutenant's response came faster than expected. Before Monroe could even respond or make a move, another vehicle pulled up, breaking the heavy air of the scene. From this vehicle came an imposing man, whose massive build and commanding attitude were evident. He was not there to argue, but to impose the truth. Behind him, a civil security team, often called upon to intervene in police abuses, arrived with immediate efficiency, reinforcing the urgency of the situation. Maya knew this was the moment where things would take a decisive turn. "Agent Monroe, you are under investigation for inappropriate conduct and unwarranted humiliation of an FBI agent," the superior declared in a firm, sharp voice, leaving no room for reply. The scene seemed suddenly frozen, time suspended in a kind of striking realism, where everything seemed to unfold with orchestrated slowness. Officer Monroe sat up, visibly uncomfortable, a shiver of uncertainty crossing his eyes. He had always believed that his position protected him, that his skin color, his build and his uniform were invincible shields. But now he was faced with a force he hadn't anticipated, a force he hadn't seen coming. With a pale face, he tried to explain, but his words were in vain, swallowed up by the shadow of his own arrogance. The truth, in all its brutality, was now there, inescapable. "Maya," her superior said, turning to her, his voice full of sincerity, "I deeply apologize for the attitude of this agent. This type of behavior has no place here. You can leave in complete safety. We will handle this case with the utmost severity." The silence that fell was heavy. The noise from the street had almost stopped. Witnesses, passers-by, Monroe's colleagues were now staring at him, a harsh light highlighting the contrast between his arrogant posture and the now inevitable humiliation. This police officer, who thought he had all the power, found himself in a position he never imagined, crushed by the heavy truth of his actions. Without another word, Maya turned on her heel and walked slowly away, her back straight, her gaze fixed ahead. She didn't turn around. Every step she took brought her back to reality. This injustice she had suffered was just another episode of what she had been through. But today, she had not only been a victim, she had won a battle. The humiliation that had been tried to inflict on her turned against her attacker, and this truth was sweet as the shadow that grew behind her. Officer Monroe would never have forgotten this moment. But even more, he would never forget the lesson that came from it. Never underestimate a black woman, never ignore the power of legitimacy, and above all, never mock what is just and right.